So, in essence, this is a perfect translation to what we're going to talk about today, which is basically applying some of what we've been talking about, the concepts behind EQ and compression, into a home mastering environment. So, we're going to talk a little bit about, doing some mastering stuff and applying some of the concepts of compression and EQ in a context related to making stuff, sound good at home. One of the things that we are going to do, I can't get this little zoom window out of my way for some reason. All right, I'll leave it there. Um, so yeah, I mean, the reality is that often nowadays the budgets of creating music and selling music aren't really huge, so we oftentimes have to do some of our own mastering. And even if we are going to have somebody else work on it, it's good to do some basic home mastering to either, send it to a friend to listen to it in the car, play it out at a gig, whatever the case may be. So this is just going to be some tips and stuff on how to do that. What we're going to be relying on also today is the workflow we started on day one, where we talked about the referencing, right? The reference tracks. So those vetted reference tracks that you decided that you'd be happy if your stuff sounded like that, and we level matched them the way we did, and we've been using them to help guide the frequencies of our mix and help give us some perspective. And we're going to continue to use them through the mastering process. And so there's a few things I'm going to talk about today that are specific in the way we're going to set some stuff up and set up a mastering session that relate to the idea of what we've already done to those reference tracks and how we're then going to be using those reference tracks to continue to guide our frequency and our frequency, I guess, frequency average of, like I talked about, listening to those 4 or 5 tracks and kind of getting a sense of what the brightest one was, the dullest one, and using that to help gauge where you want to live with your high end. And same with the low end, right? The one that's like got the most low end, the least low end, and kind of where you can kind of fit in within to at least be within that similar feeling of the low, mids, and highs, right? To guide us, right? So that's what we're going to sort of take a look a little bit about today. To just sort of demystify mastering, um, in a sense, is that the cool thing is that today I'm going to give you, for the low price of your $9 to $10 to $11 a class, the secret to a great master. And this is something that everybody wants to find out and everybody's looking for, because mastering is this mystery magic, right? So the thing is that the number one secret to a great master, the thing that makes a great master, is simply a great mix. So there is no magic. The better the mix, the better the master. We're going to talk about some things today that can help you in a context of mastering, but everything we've done up till today will have a bigger impact on the mastering than actual mastering. So I can master a great mix and make a great master, and I can master a shitty mix into an okay master, but I can't make a shitty mix into a great master. But the key is everything that came before mastering. That mastering is, yes, there's some final polish that can happen. There's obviously some leveling that needs to occur so that it's as loud as other tracks out there and all of that type of stuff. But ultimately, the way the frequencies sit and when you play something and it sounds really good, if you've been using the reference tracks, incorporating some calibrated listening to make your mix decisions, and you get a really good sounding mix that's sitting within the frequencies level matched and all the stuff we've been talking about, like that is what is going to have a big impact on what we're doing for mastering. So sorry to build this up in my silly little joke, but I know for me, for a long time in the beginning, I always wondered, like, what are they doing? How can I learn how to do that? How, I have this shitty mix, but I want to learn how to master it. It's like, focus on mixing, focus on making great sounding mixes, and then the rest will be easy. So, it's great for me as a mastering engineer to make my clients use SonarWorks so they get better sounding mixes. So I've got less work. They're not competing with themselves, and I don't have to undo that. So all of this is what kind of makes, there's no single mastering tool. Yeah, Ozone is awesome. And Ozone and a lot of the, tools that we might use in mastering can help fix bad mixes, but we can't make a great master out of a bad mix. So it's always the focus being creating a good balanced mix that sits with the frequencies. They work together individually and as a whole, and everything we've been talking about, applying those ideas and concepts to shape the tone of something via the EQ, work with some of those specific frequencies, being aware of the low mids, how to tighten up the low end, harshness in the high end, the shaping of the sound itself, using compressors, dynamically keeping things in line. All that stuff is what's going to make a great mix. But we do want to be able to do some mastering to it at home. So we want to make sure that we continue to understand the concept of the LUFS and level matching as we're mixing. Just like we took the intricate step to be able to level match one track to the next track to the next track to the next track, so that we had a consistent listening environment for those, that group of reference music that we had on one fader. And then we talked about how we then analyzed our mix LUFS, and then we brought those reference tracks down so that they were now even, so they still became useful and relevant to frequencies and to our frequency definition, right? So we're going to continue to do that. And through mastering, we definitely want to continue to jump back and forth and make sure that the track we're mastering and the tracks, our reference tracks, are constantly level matched. So it's just going to help give us that target of where we're trying to be. So really quickly, we're going to output. And this is where it kind of ties into what I was saying. We turn off SonarWorks, so we're not, calibrating our track we're sending to mastering, because again, SonarWorks is only for our own internal listening. So we render the output, and I've got like some basic settings in here and on how to render an output to bounce a track. I'm sure most of you have already done this. So, but basically, we just want the highest quality file, like the way that the session was working, whatever sample rate it was working at, that's what we're going to output. Whatever bit depth you were working at, that's what we're going to output. And we want a PCM file, not a compressed version. An MP3 is a compressed format. PCM is an uncompressed format, so that's high resolution, and that's what we want to do. What I like to do is to separate out the production from the mastering stage. Certainly in the beginning, it's really good to do that. Be comfortable with and be done with it creatively, export it, and now have a session where you're just going to be able to focus on the track being mastered and those reference tracks. Now, when we have the track, the reference tracks track, right, it's pretty easy to be able to, let's just say this is my reference track, right? So I can just copy this reference track, and then when I make a new session, let's say, if I wanted to do a new mastering session, I can pull this in and sort of just paste a new track. And so my references are here. And all the level matching that I did come with it, right? So this one came down 3.9, this one came down 3.2, right? So you don't have to redo any of that work. We're good to go with the references being in our now sort of quote master session, right? So if I want to sort of fake this, I'll get rid of these sends, I'll get rid of some of these extra tracks, and I don't think let's see here, I might have that track mixed. I probably didn't export that track for this, but the idea is what I'll do is I'll just take one of these tracks and it will become my fake master track. So let's just say this is the track that I'm about to master, which would be much lower. So I have my reference tracks in here. The level matching that I did before follows them, like we talked about. And now, the setup that you do on this once now can go from session to session, from a mix session to a master session, from a creative session to a mix session to a master session. They can just follow you. And as you, even build this, add another one of these and then copy and paste and bring it into a new session. And all the level matching work that you did and everything will follow it. And we're going to use this as we start to now build this master session, which I'll just build from scratch here right in front of us as we go. So I'm going to pull in the mix and pull in the reference track like I just did. And now what we're going to do is where we were having this reference track down low to level match against our mix version, we're going to now just sort of bring that back up to 0 and back to where we started. These individual tracks will continue to stay at their, leveled gain that we did, minus 2.2 on this one, right? So we're keeping the level matching that we did on these, we're keeping that the same. We're just bringing that fader back up to 0. And then we're going to take our track that we outputted, our mix, and we bring that in, which I sort of faked by just using this track, right? So this is the track that I want to master, let's say, and this is our reference tracks. And if I wanted to just sort of do this, bring this back to the front, bring these back to the front, this would be kind of more like what my little mastering session might look like. So now I'm going to do a few things that to set up my master. So I'm going to get my SonarWorks going, right? Like before. I'm going to get my LUFS meter. We're going to continue to use that. And then I'm also going to use, I have this spectrum analyzer that I like to use, and I'm going to show you, it's free too, so you can use it. And I'm going to show you how I set it up. I'll explain a little bit about why I set it up like that. But I'm going to get these 3 plugins going on my master. So my master fader is going to, from here on out, basically just be used for analytical purposes. All my processing is going to be done up here. And this is why I want to separate out the mix session from the master session. So it just, on some senses makes it a little easier. So I'm going to use this particular plugin, which is the Spectrum Analyzer, the free one I talked about. I also need to get SonarWorks here, and I also am going to need some sort of level match. So I'll just pull this one in for now. Actually, I'll do both of them because we can look at the Julian one and this one at the same time. So again, I'm keeping the workflow at SonarWorks is last in the chain. I have this is just analytical stuff, right? So this is a spectrum analyzer. This is one of my loudness meters, which I like to turn off the histogram. I don't really need to be confused by that. I just want to see my numbers. And then I've got this guy that I want not in RMS mode, but EBU mode. Sync is on. I mentioned how the sync will automatically reset itself, just like this auto button being on. It resets itself when I press stop and press play. I get more adequate numbers instead of it continually adding up everything, So now I've got my sort of analytics set up and all of that. So I'm going to move some of these LUFS meters out of the way. And I'm just going to go over a little bit how I set this up. And I think I have a screenshot in here too, actually. Yeah, I do. So this average time I slow down a little bit to be 2000. I'm not quite sure what that number means. I don't know if that's 2000 milliseconds, that it's giving me an average. And then I change this block size and I put the block size here at 496. This just kind of works for me. This is how I set it up, and I'll show that to you. I have this range low button. These two basically stay the same, 20 and 20. So it's going to show me from 20 hertz up to 20 kilohertz. So the full frequency range. But I'm going to take what I'm viewing, I'm going to bring this up to minus 55 for the low, the bottom, gain-wise, minus 55. And the high I bring down to minus 33. Now, so this is how I set my span. So I'll just show you real quickly on that. So I think I have it. Yeah, I don't have it presetted here. So 2000 here, I bring the block size to the 496 I said. I want my range low to be minus 55, my range high to be minus 33. Now, you might say, well, what is that? Why? What is that? So basically what I did is I adjusted my top here, and that's what I just changed, my range high. So in other words, this 33 is now my top, and this 55 is now my bottom. I did this because I sort of calibrated this to my reference tracks so that I could kind of see when I was playing through, I'll show you an example here. This one is a little bit loud, so it might come over the top there, but that's all very loud. So let me, I had that utility going as well for us so that you guys don't get too blown away. Uh-oh, yeah. Oh, I was putting all of this here. All right. My mistake. All right. I thought I clicked on the master. So hopefully you guys weren't like, wait a minute, you're doing the wrong track. I don't need two of these, but all right. So now this should sound still a little loud. What do you think? Pretty good. All right. All right, so I'm back set up, right? So I just turned off my SonarWorks because obviously these headphones aren't SonarWorks, but the workflow idea stays the same. SonarWorks is last, and I do want to use that when I'm actually mastering, but right now I'm not going to use that. So I'm going to bring this a little bit lower. All right, so I've got my level match reference tracks here, and I was talking about my setup of span, which I have going. So what I'm showing you is what I had done was I looked at my reference tracks and I looked at where the average of my kicks and stuff were hitting. And so I changed this. I think it defaulted somewhere down here and defaulted somewhere up here, right? So here's how it was when I opened the program. That wasn't really all that useful. So I made some adjustments here so that I was looking at where my reference tracks were actually hitting to make it more relevant. Let me just actually check those numbers. I think it's 33. Yeah, 33, 55, 20 to 20, 4, 5, 2000, 50, 496. Yeah, RT average is the type. Yeah, so you just follow this and you'll be looking at the same thing that I'm looking at. And just what this offers me is a little bit more dialed in view of the track. So it just became useful for me to sort of increase what I really want to see. And I line that up with like where the high end should be. So it gave me a really quick way of looking at like, if my high end is way over the top here, then I know that I'm going to need a little bit of work. But if I play this reference track, so this is how I dialed it in by looking at my reference tracks and brought my top to right about where the kick was going to be hitting. So I could just quickly see that like if I pull up something and the kick's way over top, the first thing I got to do is just bring that down. And I just looked at and saw the result of what I was viewing based on all of my reference tracks. And I came up with like kind of like the average or the main part of where I would want my low end to be hitting. And then I also took a look at what was happening down here at 30 hertz. And I brought the bottom resolution up a little bit. Like this is what it would be showing me as a much wider range from, minus something dBs up to 0, like minus 120 dBs up to 0. And it would have my frequency kind of in there. I just sort of squished that in so that what I'm looking at is more relevant. And how I set the low end is that I noticed that like pretty much all my reference tracks were just barely hitting somewhere right around this 30 hertz line. And so I sort of calibrated this way of looking at it to my reference track so I can see how much sub is happening. So that's how I set this and why I set this way. Now, how this becomes even more useful, because up until I started to do this level matched reference track workflow, spectrum analyzers were a bit elusive to me and I could never quite figure out how to really use them because they were moving really fast. And also I couldn't figure out how to really make them relevant because imagine if I play one reference track that I hadn't done this whole LUFS level matching thing to, and then another one, and there's 4 dBs difference. I mean, I'll be looking at 4 dBs difference in all the frequencies. So I never really used spectrum analyzers until I started to really get into the level matching of my reference tracks, where I'm creating a more even representation of song to song. The accuracy now of using things like analytical tools like a spectrum analyzer became way more accurate and useful. So combining this way of, wanting to use my ears, wanting to use my SonarWorks, wanting to use my reference tracks, but now I'm adding in an analytical component that, because I'm actually using it and comparing it to the level matched reference tracks, again, that I vetted and said I would be happy if my track sounded like that. I'm getting to know those and know their averages, and I'm kind of mixing within that. And then now I can, use a spectrum analyzer in a much more accurate way. So I've gotten to the point now where I've seen so many reference tracks go through this spectrum analyzer that I can almost start a master job with my speakers off and do some overall level adjustments right off the bat. Like too much bass, I can clearly see because it's going to be over my top. If it's way too far under, if it's hitting way down in here, then I know that I'm going to have to kind of bring that up. So my analytical tools become an important part, especially in this whole idea of this class, which is mixing from home. Most of us don't have these ideal mixing environments, right? So I'm combining all of this technology, the LUFS, the reference tracks idea, and then adding in some analytical tools to also now make us achieve these better results at home. So my master's now set up. I've got my analytical tool that I'm going to be using, and my level match stuff, my ability to double check my LUFS, and I've got my track that I'm about to master in here, right? So that's where we're at. So let me just see if I do have the track we've been listening to somewhere here that I can actually sort of master it on the fly, but I might not, because, guys, I use a couple different computers, and this one works for my actually, I do. Look at you go, JJ. I have, actually, I don't need to save this. I did already build a mixing from home mastering session. That's good news. All right. Yeah. So here's the output of the track that we were listening to. And here's my reference tracks, my level matched reference tracks. The workflow here is the same. I copy and pasted this. I brought the fader to 0. I've retained all of my, individual level matching things that I did initially here to these tracks, right? These all came down in different amounts. And that came with this. This is a little different set of reference tracks, but the point is they come in with what I was using them before. I pull that right in, and then here's my track being mastered. I take a look at this master fader also. It's the same type of thing. I don't need that. I have my SonarWorks last. This utility is just for us. I've got my span, my analytical tool. This is another level. It's a limiter, but I just use it for checking my levels. So. And my loudness meters like I had before, right? Okay, so now my sort of master session is kind of set up, and I've got everything, in there that I'm going to need. Let's see, did I lose my? Oh no, I moved it down to the bottom. There it is. Okay, sorry. This is, yeah. All right. So this next part here can oftentimes be a little bit confusing to people. So I'm gonna explain this by looking at what we've done. We started when I showed my reference tracks. I came up with that. Sorry. When we started doing the reference tracks here, we level matched them. When we moved, we brought the gains down on a bunch of these, right? So this one came down 1.4. This one came down 1.4 also. This one came down a little bit more, 4.5. This one came down a little bit less, just 0.78, right? So if you think about this, all of those reference tracks were mastered records, right? They were, loud, and we took a few dBs of gain away from them. Uh, so those reference tracks all came down a little bit in level, right? So just like we're using them for an average of the frequency spectrum, and from that, I mean, like I've said several times, where I listen to the reference tracks and, one's going to have a little bit more low end than another, but that gives me my range. One's going to be a little bit brighter. One's going to have a little more mid range. One's going to have a little less, but that offers me that frequency range, right? So while I'm listening to those and, jumping through a few of the reference tracks, I really get a decent sense of kind of like the overall shape of where I want to be living. But also, if I think about the average of how much I brought them down, that that number can give me an idea of where I want my average loudness to be in the end. Okay? So here's how this becomes relevant. So remember, each of these came down a little bit. In my experience, I've got my main set of reference tracks is like 22 reference tracks. And when I literally come up with the average, it's 2 dBs. So the average gain reduction is 2 dBs. Some came down a half, some came down 4, but the average of the gain reduction is 2 dBs across all of these reference tracks, right? So those are mastered reference tracks that I brought the gain down a little bit to now use them in here, right? So now, as I'm preparing to do my mastering, and this is the track that I'm going to master, and remember what I said is that all my master fader here, the actual master fader in my mastering session, is just my analytical tools, that my processing is going to go on this track that I'm about to master, right? So on this track that I'm about to master, there's going to be a limiter. So this track is going to be considered a mastered version of my track compared to a mastered version of these reference tracks. Well, the average that these reference tracks came down was 2 dB. So what I want to do is take this fader down after limiting, because these were mastered after limiting. The average I brought them down was 2 dB. So now when I'm going to work on my track I'm mastering after the limiter, which the only thing after the limiter in this case is the fader, I bring the fader down 2 dB. Now, this here is to sort of equalizes the wrong word, but to sort of get in line with the amount of gain reduction I did after limiting to my reference tracks. So once I do this, it'll be easier for me because I can compare. If I take a look at my reference track here, right? If I take a look at my master and I know that my reference tracks are going to be coming in, I can actually turn this down for us because we just want to see this. But so I know that my reference tracks are coming in at about -10 integrated and short term, right? We set that up 5 days ago. And the average that I brought all these down is 2 dBs. Then on the track that I'm going to master, I bring this fader down 2 dB. And then when I'm adding my limiting and reaching the same LUFS, my actual resulting loudness is going to be somewhere in the middle of the loudness of all these reference tracks. Now, just like when I turn off SonarWorks to bounce this out, I'm going to put this back to 0. So once I'm done and I'm ready and I'm finally ready to deliver this master, I bring this back to 0. And so the resulting output is going to now be the average right in between all of these in their unlevel matched state. Okay, so I'm going to just pause for a second because this is a little bit of a confusing concept to get. And it actually took me a while to get it. Once I sort of started setting up this workflow, I was like, oh, it's so much easier now to like sit my loudness right in the average of these reference tracks. sit my frequency right in the average of these reference tracks and come up with better sounding, closer to the reference tracks, finished products at home. So does this make sense? Anybody have any questions about where we're at and just this setup here? We're good. Okay, cool. Anyone? Okay. All right, so that's an important part of this process. So we're going to continue to use our -10 because that's where we started with these reference tracks. They're faders at 0, but each of these were brought down a couple of dBs to equal -10 when we use our analytical master fader level meter here, right? And so when I go to my track being mastered and I set my limiter on the track being mastered, which is already on, this is the limiter I'm using, whatever, right? And so I've got this track nice and loud, but like, where do I do it? Like, how loud do I do it? And that's when I pull this to -2. I'm going to turn off some of these plugins because my thing is acting weird. My CPU can't keep up, so sounding super glitchy. So when I apply my limiting here on the track I'm trying to master, and when I look at achieving the same LUFS as my reference tracks, right? So we're listening to the track I'm trying to master with some limiting on. I get an even more relevant comparison here because even though LUFS has the ability to listen into mastered and compressed music, the fact that I'm now actually using it to level match mastered and compressed music against, compressed, mastered, so-called home mastered music, or limited at least, right? We now get an even more accurate level matching and a more accurate listening experience, combined with the ability to look at where these are on my frequency analyzer, which always all these open in the other window, but right. So here's where my reference track is hitting, and again, this is, I told you I set my top so that I knew where my kick was. I got a sense of where I can see kind of where my high end is, and I didn't, taking a look at this sub frequency when I compare a bunch of tracks, I know where those are supposed to be. Right, so we see some consistency here. This is one of the brighter reference tracks, but the low end is still pretty consistent to where that was hitting before. It's a little less below 30 hertz, but it's pretty accurate from one another. So this kick is just a hair bit louder, but the high end seems pretty similar, right? So this is how, when I'm using the level match reference tracks, I even get a better picture in my analytical tools. So now let's say I've gotten a sense of what I'm looking at here, what I'm listening to here, and all of that. And if I go back, I'm going to turn off some of this stuff that I had already done so we can kind of see. I'm just going to leave the limiter on so we're comparing the same level. We see that this is a pretty damn good mix. It's, pretty close to what we had there, but I could probably use a little bit more low end here, maybe a little less in these low mids here, and maybe take a look at what's happening with some of these spikes up here, right? So this is just the quick example of how the level matching, the analytical tools now can combine to actually allow me to do some pretty good stuff. So even though I'm just sort of messing with it in these headphones, I can make some changes based on what I'm seeing by looking at the average of where I was and actually make an okay master even without, on my real speakers or whatever. So, all right. So now that this sort of basic first step is set up, let's take a look at some of the rest of this. So now this next, piece is pretty much like what we were doing in mastering. And this is just sort of like, or sorry, we were doing in mixing, and we were doing this to the we talked about the elements that we did want in the low end. So I usually do this now in mastering as just a safety net. So one of the first things I'm going to set up is that low end monoing on the track that I'm going to master. So we'll take a look first in the chain here. I've got this utility set up in that bass mono, so I know that everything below, I can monitor the frequency here, what's happening. So this is just sort of that safety net of like just making sure that all my low end is nice and contained and nice and monoed out. So that's my, step one in mastering. And then if I didn't do any bus compression in mixing, which, as I've built a relationship with the guys I do mastering for, I usually tell them to turn that off and let me do that, because I'll be able to adjust that if need be in relationship to all the other things I'm doing in mastering, right? But so here's where I'm sort of like doing this is like the last step in mixing, first step in mastering. It sort of blurs that line. A lot of people will use a little bit of this bus compression because of that glue that it adds, like we talked about, in the mixing phase. But oftentimes I'll tell my guys, okay, cool, use it, make your mix sound great, but then turn it off because I'll be, doing that myself. But in this case, I'm doing something that I'm mastering something that I did myself. So I'm going to use, I know I turned off my master bus compressor, and I'm going to do it as the first step in mastering versus the last step in mixing. So I'm going to use the master bus 2 setting that was from the example on the compression day. The key here was using the high pass filter to get mid to the lows and a little bit faster attack. So I'll go ahead and set that up on this track. And it's pretty much set up. So remember we talked about the release time on the glue compressor being 100 milliseconds, 200 milliseconds, 400 milliseconds, and how 240 milliseconds was 120 beats per minute, decent speed. So I'm choosing the 200 milliseconds here for my release time, and it seems to be bouncing pretty well with my rhythm. So I've added a little bit of that glue compressor. As I said, that sort of blurs the line between the last step in mixing and first step in mastering, but that's how I set that up. So now this next thing is a little bit of a tip that I'm going to pass along and show you. It also involves a free plugin. Now I learned this from Bob Katz, and Bob Katz is considered to be, the mastering guy's mastering guy, right? And I learned it from him and his workflow, but also from this Weiss mastering compressor, this white unit that sat in pretty much every mastering studio that I saw in any magazine. You would see this white, thing. And it was released as a piece of software a couple years ago, and it was pretty expensive, but it's a $6,000 mastering compressor and de-esser, and they had it for $500 for software. But I was like, well, before I buy it, I want to understand it. What is it doing? Why do people like it? What is it doing? And then I learned about the way that it was set up and found this free compressor. Someone pointed me towards this free compressor that can be set up in the same way. And what I'm basically doing here is I'm doing a sort of parallel compression, like we've sort of talked about already, where we set up the compressor and then we use that kind of mix knob type of a thing to get a sort of compressed version and an uncompressed version. But I'm going to use it in a clean way. So in other words, remember how the attack time, the release time was what was causing distortion. When we compressed a lot, the release time made it distorted. So I'm going to use this in a mastering context, and I don't want it to necessarily be distorted. So I'm going to set my release time a little bit slower. And there's a couple other things about this compressor, but basically the idea and why I'm using it is that it similar to the way we can use parallel compression to do some shaping to a sound, some texturing to a sound in some of those example settings that I put there. We're going to do that here in this mastering setting, mastering environment, and the way we're going to set this up. And the sound that I'm going for is this little bit of a texture that it adds. It's working a little bit like putting a little bit of this analog texture and feel into this digital master. I'm going to use this particular plugin because it's a clean. So here's the link to it, and I'll show you the screen pictures. And then here's the way that I set it up and the way that they say to set it up, which kind of matches the way this Weiss mastering compressor works, and with the way Bobcat sets up the Weiss mastering compressor for this reason. It's mastering parallel compression. So it's meant to be clean, but it's meant to be a little bit of a texture. So it's not so much dirty, but it's texture. And it's kind of working by taking a very compressed signal and mixing a little bit in from the bottom, just like we talked about in the compression setting. So it's not crazy. It's just this plugin works a little differently. And so this is how I set it up. And this is what it looks like, and it's free, and I send you the link, right? But it basically puts this little subtle amount of smoothing the transient, like that analog texture. So it's very subtle to hear it, but it definitely just has this, it puts a little bit of body into the track. The result puts a little bit of body into the track and a little bit of subtle roundness to the signal being mixed in. The one thing that, there's a couple things that make this a little bit different, but here you see how this peak crest is a way of changing between peak release analyzation and RMS release analyzation. So another word for release time average is crest. So it's just another piece of language. But this knob gives us the ability to crossfade. And if you remember, I talked about how auto release on plugins work across two planes. Remember that? And those two planes were, one was working pretty quickly and the other was working a little bit slowly. So it was a very transparent way. So that's interesting to sort of translate what we already talked about to see this and kind of make a little bit of sense of it. But we have an RMS release or a peak release, but we're not going to use this. We're setting it up the way that we're looking now, the way that I defined, and I'll show it to you. The other difference here about this particular plugin, the rest we see, right? Threshold, we talked about that. Attack, we have two releases, but release peak, release RMS probably make more sense after going through the compression class. We have soft knee, which we have talked about what it does, and we have ratio, right? So all of that is the same, right? This low frequency relax is the similar idea of the sidechain EQ, right? Remember how we took a little bit of the low end out? That's what this is doing, right? So this is an example of how the understanding the ideas behind these knobs and compressors gives you the ability to kind of look at some other ones and sort of, you know, translate a little bit of how they work and all that. Now, the main difference here is that what we have is we don't have a mix knob like we do on this plugin, this dry wet. We don't have a dry wet. What we have is this dry mix level and then the makeup gain, which represents the compressed level. So it's basically those two knobs give you the equivalent of what would be dry wet, but it's just done in a little different way. So when we set this up, what we're doing is, because we're using this, remember, it's a parallel process, we're going to send the dry level 100%. So the dry level is all the way up. The dry level is coming straight through unprocessed. And we're using this, the makeup gain, in other words, to take a compressed signal and set it to where we want it. And I usually set it somewhere right around -10. So I'll just quickly set that up on the track that I'm mastering here. I've already done this bus compressor, right? So I'm just gonna reorder these because the bus compressor being the sort of, you know, last step in mixing, and then this being a mastering compression. So I'm putting this after. So I'm just thinking about the gain stage and signal flow, right? So I'll set this plugin up to the way that I described. The threshold basically comes all the way down to -50. The peak crest knob is all the way to peak. The soft knee is 0. We don't want any knee. The ratio 2.5. The attack is as fast as it can go. So do you notice this is a very fast attack and it's a very low threshold? This threshold here has the ability, I'm at 19.4, it goes to 40. This goes all the way to 50. So there's a little bit more that can happen. The dry level here is going all the way through, and my makeup gain I'm setting to -10. What this is going to do is it's going to be basically constantly compressing my song to be mixed. Now, I know that from just looking at these settings, right? It's a really fast attack. And even though the ratio is that 2.5 to 1, which is kind of moderate, the threshold is so low that I know that I'm going to be pretty much always crossing that threshold. So let's just look at what that's going to look like. The gain reduction is showing about 25 dBs of gain reduction, pretty much constantly, even if I play this break.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now I'm going to play with this mix knob, and you'll see how like this is just going to be the dry signal. All right, if I bypass this, nothing changing. Dry signal's 100%, and the makeup gain is so low, minus 60. There's really no, we're not hearing really any of that, right? But the way I set it up is we go with about minus 10. And I sort of dabble with this from like about minus 8 to about minus 12, 14, depending on what type of a signal I want, but I usually start at about minus 10. And so this is adding a constantly compressed, very fast, non-transient signal. So there's no points, right? The compression is instant because the attack time is so fast. The threshold is so low. It's constantly compressing. And I'm just adding in a little bit of that underneath. Now, on my shitty headphones with my computer clicking, am I going to be able to hear this? I don't know, but I will play it back and bypass it and see if you can hear it. What I'm listening for is a subtle little extra little energy in some of the tails of the individual hits that I'm hearing. It's sort of bringing up that sort of in between. I'm sort of pushing forward a little bit of that texture that lives in the track already. I'm sort of just making it feel a little bit more compressed, kind of from the bottom up. So I'm sort of doing a little bit of this sort of compress, taking an over compressed sound and pushing it up and kind of doing this little bottom up compression, but in a way that has a very pleasing, softer, more sort of this analog parallel compression emulation kind of trick, I guess. So I'll turn it off and on for a second. I can, I know what I'm listening for. I can sort of hear a subtle little bit of roundness, a little bit of thickness going on, a light little bit amount of softening of some of the transients, but it's the clicks and stuff are getting in the way. So you'll have to play with this. It's definitely a bit of an advanced listening tip, but it's something that like the way I look at it is I do a few things or a bunch of little subtle things that all contribute in a small way to create a nice whole. But that's the idea behind this mastering parallel compression. So at this stage, I've got a little bit of the bus compression set and a little bit of this mastering parallel compression set. Now, the mastering bus compression is that glue, right? So it's sort of helping the top down just to sort of put a little bit of a dB or two of a little bit of togetherness to like the mids and highs, like I talked about. Then I've got this mastering parallel, which is this sort of, little bit of body, a little bit of texture being added from the bottom up in a pleasing, sort of way. And now I'm going to move on to apply some of the rest of this stuff. Now, I've already put the limiter on, but normally what I would do next is I would make sure that my level now is nice and loud. So like there's there's not too much of a frequency difference if I'm applying this compressor. I'm not applying it for the amount of compression. I'm applying it necessarily for like how the little bit of compression sounds and feels. And I know what I'm looking for and listening for. So I can apply that without the limiter, and the limiter is going to come later anyway. So I've got these guys going. The next step that I'm going to do is now get this track nice and leveled to my reference track. So I then would apply my limiter. I'm going to apply the limiter and then go back and do some other steps. But I want to be doing those other steps in relation to how loud it is. So I apply the limiter. Now, this is some sample settings that can use for the Ableton limiter. Unfortunately, it's not a super powerful limiter in terms of being able to achieve the type of level that we might be trying to go for to compete today. I'm not trying to get into this whole like level war or whatever, but I also live in the reality that like the guys I work with want their stuff to be, close to as loud as the other stuff out there. I definitely tell them like I'm not going to be the loudest mastering engineer you can find. I'll be competitive, but I also shoot for clean. But this limiter is not going to get you there. But here's some example settings to be able to do that. The logic limiter won't get you there either, Mike, but just so you know. So this is the one tool that I'm going to talk about that I use outside of anything stock, but this is the limiter of choice for me. And it allows me to do limiting to achieve the amount of level that I want today, but also with the cleanness that I want. I don't want it to be distorted and crunchy and be a bad just to get the amount of level I need. So this is the limiter that I use, and this is what I'm going to use. So I'm setting up my limiter here, which I technically already did, but if I go through the process of I put my limiter on. Now, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to set the output of my limiter to -1. So the reason behind this is that most of the way music is consumed nowadays is from lossy and converted files, like an MP3 or like an AAC file or an M4A file, right? So, Apple Music, iTunes, Spotify play AAC files, level matched AAC files. But in other words, they take a high res file and they convert it down to MP4 or AAC file. So AAC, Apple Audio Codec, an AAC file is just basically MP3 version 2. But Apple got together with the people that made the MP3 and they jointly developed an even better sounding small file size, right? Just quick history. So most of the way music is consumed is with a lossy conversion. The process of that conversion, creating an MP3 from a high-res WAV file or AIF file, has to get rid of some stuff, and the process of conversion can oftentimes cause clipping. So the thing here is that a few years ago, you may have heard of, now it's called Apple Digital Masters. Before that, it was called Mastered for iTunes. Uh, what Apple implemented was they basically said, we want the highest quality audio file we can get. We believe in our codec. The AAC codec sounds very, very good, sounds very, very close to a high-res file, but how can we guarantee that it sounds even better or the best that it can? Because they by that point they already had billions of songs on servers all over the world. They couldn't say, oh, we're just going to start selling WAV files, right? At 10 times the file size, 9 times the file size, right? It would just be impossible. They couldn't afford the server space and bandwidth, right? And it would be slow for us and all of that. So they said, well, okay, we've got this AAC codec that we developed that sounds fucking really good. How do we make sure that that stays sounding really good? Well, when they developed this whole mastered for iTunes concept, the main key component of that is that there had to be some headroom in the master and so that the AAC file, when it's made, wouldn't clip. So when I studied that to be able to deliver mastered for iTunes files years ago, I sort of realized that, like, okay, that makes sense. But I also realized that a lot of my guys sell their music on Beatport and iTunes, which are MP3s. And so I took a look at that and was like, well, even an MP3, most of the time, if I don't have some headroom for the conversion, which is the idea behind bringing the output of the limiter to -1, I'm creating a little bit of headroom for that conversion to work. If I've got a file that's already up to 0 because I don't bring the output of my limiter and then I bounce that out and now I convert it to an MP3, it's going to clip. So I thought to myself, well, why don't I start to deliver a better sounding master to my clients? And so that headroom is necessary to help make a little bit of a better sounding final result. And that final result is, the high res file, the AIF or the WAV, is still going to sound really good. There's no conversion that's going to happen. It's just going to have a little bit 1 dB down. Well, I mean, 1 dB down, we're still achieving a good level. I showed you how to do that. We're bringing that fader down. We're sitting within the average loudness of our reference tracks. I can still achieve that, especially with this limiter. I just build in a little bit more headroom for the actual conversion because I know Spotify, Apple Music, Pandora, and all those are going to make lossy versions of this. And I'm going to build in a little bit of headroom. So that's why I set it up like this when I set up my converter. And what this takes into account is that in the digital realm, we think about, you've heard of sample rate, 44.1 sample rate, 48K sample rate. These black dots here represent the sample rate. And the green and red represents what's going to happen when it's now not just sample dots representing, but actually an analog waveform in the real world. And what can happen is you can get some buildup between two peaks, especially when something is really loud, which is a prime example of a limited mastered song, right? Where we've crunched it down and made it loud. We can get this example where these intersample peaks occur, where, in other words, we get louder than digital zero if we don't have some headroom built into the output of the limiter, right? So that's what this is doing, and this is what I talk about here. So that's why I set the output of the limiter to -1. So I set up my limiter. I've got my little compression going. I set my limiter output to -1, and now I start to apply limiting. Now on here, it's the gain on this particular plugin, and I'm gonna now take the loudest part of my song, and I'm gonna look at where I'm trying to be. Like, I know I'm trying to be about -10 LUFS, right? And I know that that's now really relevant because, remember, I took my fader down 2 dBs, which represents the post-limiting amount that I brought down, average, that I brought down these reference tracks. So I know that I'm going to have a limiter here. I've got 1 dB built in for my headroom for conversion. I've got this 2 dB here that is strictly just for my monitoring for now. I'm going to remove that later. My end result is really just going to have this 1 dB, if that, hopefully that makes sense. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look at my integrated and short-term loudness. I know where these guys, the reference tracks, sit. We've already looked at that. I'm shooting for about -10, and I'm going to add my limiter to reach that same goal. So I've got a little bit of compression, bus compression happening, a little bit of that mastering parallel, and I'm getting now my limiter. I'll push it a little bit harder. A few more dBs of gain reduction here. Stop and start, which is a reset for me. Okay, checking that that wasn't changing something for some reason. All right, so this seems to be about right. A little bit too loud, so I'm going to back off a bit. Now, this plugin has loudness metering built in. See here, I got short term. And what it does, it shows me short term, but it also shows me short term that's going to be like after this particular that -1 that I put in. Now, this is also could be kind of confusing, but basically the idea here is that it's giving me an LUFS number internally in this plugin, but not taking into consideration this -2. So that's, kind of good for me in a sense, because I know that with this number -2 and playing it with the amount of limiting I have, I'm ending up on my master analytical tools. I'm seeing the proper, -10, right? We saw that. Pretty close. I'll put a little bit more on. And this here is showing me -8 because, again, it's not taking into account this -2. So my point here is that my final output is going to be -8 LUFS, which that's a pretty loud record. It's competitively loud. It's got this little bit of headroom built in. I'm level matched now to my reference tracks. Right? These are hitting just about the same. So I've got a little bit of compression, a little bit of mastering compression, and now I've got my limiting, and now I'm level matched against my reference tracks, and now I'm really now comparing apples to apples, right? I've got a limited, little bit compressed master that I'm working on compared to limited and compressed masters of my reference tracks. They're all level matched to one another, so I can click through any of these now and get a really good sense of where my frequencies are, where their frequencies are. It's just sort of taking one more step forward. Like we were using these reference tracks in mixing, but now we're translating that into this mastering and putting the rest of the stuff on it. So now, once I've got my levels pretty much there and my compression level pretty cool, now I can really start to now adjust my frequencies. So I'm going to take a look at, why did I close this little guy again? Let's see. Yeah, here it is. So now I've got my limiter. I talked about why I backed off the 1 dB on the limiter, where we're taking into account the intersample peaks and also the conversion for the AAC file, MP4, or 320. So I built in some headroom so that those are going to be the clean as possible. I talk about, like I showed you, the way the spectrum analyzers now become even more accurate. And so I can use those to help support my what I'm hearing, right? So now I'm going to adjust some EQ. Now I said that I applied the limiter and I'm going to now adjust EQ, but I'm not putting the EQ after the limiter. So the EQ is still going to come before the limiter. I mean, ultimately the limiter is the last thing in the chain, right? So when I look here, well, there's this tool, but I'll explain that later. This is a tool that checks that conversion that I was talking about, that AAC conversion. So we'll get into that later. But my limiter is the last in the chain here, right? Now my EQ is going to come before that. So I'm going to take a look at and listen. Yeah, so these guys are a little richer in the low end, a little lighter in the low mids, but it's a pretty close mix. That's a little bit dull compared to my other reference tracks. But my track overall sounds just kind of like a little bit bright in a sense because it's missing, some low end. So I can also now kind of take a look here and give some support to my ears, especially on these terrible headphones, right? So I see where my reference tracks are all sitting. This one's just coming above the line, but most of the others are going to be a little bit below it. So now I can just sort of kind of dial in my low end, which I kind of already did. That's pretty close. I may even back off on this a little bit. I'll go 5 dBs on this shelf here. But this is the implementation of the idea that like the level match reference tracks, analytical tools, and why I set this guy up this way now support me in a way that like even on these headphones, I was able to dial in that bass just by knowing what I'm looking at in a apples to apples environment because I'm level matched to each other and dialing in this low end here to make it sound better and support what I hear, but also what I see, right? And to me, it's the being able to use some of these analytical tools, sort of is the compounding thing of this whole idea of making good sounding music at home, because the principle of at home, in a sense, means like it's not an ideal listening environment. You might be on headphones. Well, I can still actually make a really relevant master by relying heavily on my analytical tools for things like the low end, because they're apples to apples comparisons, and all that. So I would go and dial in a little bit of EQ here, um, which I did, and sort of fix the low end. I know where I want to move on. So yeah, I'm getting close to the end, so that's good. So now I would think about a little bit of mid-side EQ, in a sense of, um, in a mixing environment, a mid-side EQ has sometimes offered me some, cool. It's a cool tool to use, but certainly in a mastering environment, a mid-side EQ can be very useful because I have the ability to EQ the mono or middle information differently, uh, or or the stereo, the left and the right information. And so I can actually shape a little bit of the stereo-ness and the frequencies within the stereo-ness using a mid-side EQ. Now, if I was just in the mixing environment, I can take a look at, my synth that's really stereo and EQ that, or push up or pan something, or you know what I mean? Like I can do some sort of frequency balancing in the stereo field based on the parts themselves. But once I don't have access to the parts themselves, a mid-side EQ can be really, really awesome. Now the cool thing is that we have the ability to use this EQ8 in mid-side mode, where this mode here, I can change it to be mid-side versus the stereo or left-right. So this first EQ I'm using to do that bass shift that I did, and some high end adjustments I did up here, is just in stereo mode. But now this guy I've got in this mid side mode. So I want to take a look at the sides, and what I did was I put a little bit of this filter on the sides just to sort of rein in some of the low end out of the sides, which also is going to support this bass mono thing, uh, just a little bit further, because you notice how there's a little bit coming away between 100 and 200. This guy I have set at 120. So it's just supporting a little bit of that, making sure that low end doesn't have any stereo information in it. But also I put this little shelf and added a couple dBs to open up the stereo-ness on the sides. So it's like I'm not necessarily brightening up the whole song, because the song itself felt, bright, but I just put a little bit of brightness on the sides on this. So, this is some of the ways that this is a typical way that I'm often using a mid-side EQ to sort of make sure that the low end just sort of, that filter kind of shaping out some of the low end as support for whatever my, bass mono thing is doing, and being able to adjust that to, affect this low mids and make sure it's not too stereo in there if it sounds out of place. And then oftentimes a little bit of pushing of the brightness of if the song itself feels like it could use a little bit of, freshness or vibe on the sides, a little bit of, this sort of light shelf boost, a couple dBs on the sides, can often open up and have it feel like it's got a little bit more stereo. So it's a subtle approach, but it's kind of cool. I also, on here, oh yeah, here I didn't do anything to the middle part. There's no middle EQ. I'm just using the side part of this, or the stereo, affecting just the stereo information on the sides. So uh, that's just an actual application way that I would oftentimes use a mid-side EQ, or I would be trying to fix some sort of a problem. So the fact that I have the ability now to EQ something that's just in the center, for example, maybe like a lead vocal, the kick or the bass, I can just use a mid EQ to just sort of address certain areas of that stuff that's happening in the middle separately than what I might on, say, like a, really wide pad, where maybe I want to take some low mids out of just the sides or whatever. Those are some examples of how I would use a mid-side EQ. It's super handy to be able to have that ability to just sort of drop into this mid-side mode and do it. Not that it's not handy to sometimes do this in a mixing scenario, but it's certainly handy in a mastering scenario. If you feel like you want some, little bit of sort of brightness to happen or a little bit of more excitement on the stereo field, you can sort of, try that there. So use a little bit of the up mid side stuff. Now, oftentimes what I'm doing from here on out is if I need to do some multiband or if I need to do some de-essing or high frequency compression or additional tools to help certain things. And the idea behind a multiband is we covered quickly the multiband, but the whole concept behind a multiband and when you would use a multiband was that by definition, if the dynamics across different frequencies changed at different times, right? So the example that I gave, that like a vocal is a prime example for using a multiband compressor, but you know, a clap sample, it might not need a multiband compressor because it's going to be the same frequencies every time pretty much, right? So in a mastering scenario, that's the perfect example of when I might need some additional control that's varied by frequency. Now, I've talked about a little bit of bus compression for the purpose of putting that glue of the mids and highs and making that sort of work together. I talked about this parallel mastering compression that makes it a little bit of body, gives it this sort of feeling with the softer transients of the amount that attacks so fast, and just pushing a little bit of that in gives it a nice sort of feeling while upping the level and all that. Those are two different purposes. One purpose for a multiband might be because there's a part in the song where the mid range maybe sticks out. Maybe there's a lead sound that comes in, or a guitar solo, or the vocal, or the chorus of the song, or something. And I might need to just sort of pull that section in. So I might use a multiband compressor and set it to the point where it's not really doing much until the part where the frequencies exceed that area that I want to deal with. So now would be the time that I would start to deal with those dynamic discrepancies over the course of the entire song. Some section that I might need to deal with that if I do an EQ, it's going to affect the entire song. But if I dial in a multiband just to do what it needs to do around that frequency, it can be useful to, to kind of help keep it into shape if I want. The last step is where we can use this cool plugin that comes with all Macs. So if you have a Mac, Apple includes this AAC. It's called Round Trip AAC. And remember I was talking about how the reason I backed off my limiter is to create a little bit of headroom for the conversion. So this free plugin can show me what's going on. It's here as just if I just look here, plugin, AU, audio unit plugin, and it's by Apple, and it's Round Trip AAC, or AU Round Trip AAC. So that's the plugin there. What this shows me is it shows me the result of the iTunes Plus conversion, and it's going to allow me to see the source or the input. So it's the samples and intersample peaks, which I sort of covered really quickly, and you'll see there's a difference there. And it's going to show me the encoded, so the result of the iTunes Plus encoding or the high quality 128 or whatever, right? So it's going to show me the encoding, and it's going to show me the source peaks, any clips that occur. And this is just a way for me to sort of verify that what I'm doing is going to be a really clean sounding, the cleanest possible AAC file. So if I look at what I've got going on, so these numbers changed, right? So my sample peaks are basically on my source file -1, right? My limiter is setting my sample peaks, and I also am adjusting for intersample peaks. But the encoded version, you notice how this right side came up 0.2 of a dB. So it's already increased a little bit. And we have intersample peaks on the encoded version that are up to 0.7. So they've already come up 0.3 of a dB. That's just one little section of the song. So you see how me building in that headroom helps, because I don't have any clips. I'm about 0.7 of a dB away from clipping. If I let the song continue to play, that might change. I notice here there's like a little spike. So let's see what happens there. So my encoding is inching a little bit closer here to 0. I still got plenty of room. I've got no clips. I've got no sample or intersample peaks. So I'm in pretty good shape to know that I've got a fairly loud master, and and that I don't have any clipping. If I do on this limiter the way most people would tell you to set a limiter, which is going to be like what, you know, zero point 0.3, like something really close to zero, 0.03 or something, which is the way I used to set my limiter back in the day, or even, point just minus zero point 0.1. Let's see what happens with my iTunes Plus or my AAC file. That's what's going to be on Spotify. Oh, immediately clipped. My intersample peaks have pretty much hit zero. They didn't actually clip because I do have this guy set to kind of help me avoid that. But by getting too loud, by not having this headroom for conversion, I've got a digitally clipping AAC file. Now, would I really be able to hear that? That's debatable. But why would I not want to make sure that the number one way of consuming music is the cleanest possible file for my clients? So that's why I back off my limiter to -1, which gives me a little headroom. And I choose -1 because I've done a whole bunch of tests and that keeps me pretty far away from zero. I could finesse this based on what I was looking at, play the whole song, look at these numbers, and come close and make sure it doesn't clip if I wanted to, right? So if I try this now, I can I can finesse this output if I want, play the entire song and look at what happens here and use these numbers because these numbers relate to one another. Like this will tell me how much room I've got left for the encoding itself, right? But this is for an AAC file. Now the thing is that the MP3 file, which a lot of my clients use MP3 files for especially DJ music, right, on Beatport and TrackSource. So an MP3 file has less headroom. So I use the -1 to know that my WAV file is going to be clean. My AAC file, which for Spotify and all the streaming is going to be clean. And I'm going to have a mostly non-clipped MP3. Occasionally, I might get a clipping on the MP3, but the MP3 has less headroom in it. Oh, these numbers are a little bit off. Sorry, I have to adjust that. But just to give you the idea here is that the WAV file can take whatever you throw into it, right? There's, that it can absorb. You don't really need headroom for like a high res file. As soon as you start to convert it, an AAC file, you need a little bit of headroom. An MP3, which is an older, not as good sounding, not as well designed codec, it needs even more headroom. So I find that -1 output on my limiter sort of walks through all of those areas to get me as clean as possible between all three. I might have a little bit clipping MP3. I definitely won't have a clipping WAV file, and I most likely will not have a clipping AAC file. And that's why I set that up for that to achieve, these best possible results. So at this point, at this point, I would bounce the master. So now remember, I've got it all set up. I've checked my levels. I think it's all good to go. This AA round trip tool is just an analytical tool, so I'm going to turn that off. I'm going to turn off my, mastering analytical tools. I'm going to turn off my SonarWorks, and I'm going to reset this fader to 0 because remember, that's my way of level matching my mastered track to these mastered tracks using the average level I brought all these down. I'm going to bring down my fader a little bit. And so now I'm going to export, and then that will be my, final master. From there, I just make sure and do all my other normal comparisons. Now I, play it in the car, play it in the club, play it at my friend's studio, play it in my headphones, make some notes, figure out what I want to change, and then I can come back into this mastering session and do those changes if I feel like I need to. So that's how I make pretty damn good sounding music um, at home. Again, 2 minutes to spare. Okay, let me see if I can find it. Oh yeah, sorry, chat window was hidden. Are we at final LUFS yet? What do we do when our Brenner relay up to matched with it and our mix sounds very muddy? Okay. Um, so uh, what do we do? Well, when I bring my limiter up, if my mix is sounding muddy, I'm going to try to address it via EQ, right? Because remember, what I do is I do a little bit of that compression, I do my limiting, and I make sure that I'm level matched now to my reference tracks, and then I really listen and look. And so if it's muddy, my guess is you're going to be able to look and see some stuff. And what you're probably going to see when you say muddy is you're going to see it being way over the top here, either in the low end or too heavy in this area, which is this is representing from 80 hertz to 300 hertz, right? From 80 hertz to 300 hertz. You're probably going to see a mix that is pretty heavy in there. So if I fake this by showing you what a muddy mix would kind of look like. So muddy, cloudy, talks to this area that I was talking about when I talked about EQ, that 200 to 400. If it sounds sweatery, it sounds dull. So when I do that limiting and I start to and what I hear is cloudy and muddy, I can probably look and see that it's going to be in this realm if it sounds. And here's where the application of the language and some of those frequencies I talked about also translate into the mastering scenario. So when it looks like it's dull sounding, it's probably too heavy in here, and some removal in here can help open up the mids and highs and make it sound more high fidelity. And if it sounds muddy, odds are that's going to live between 80 and 200. So I can look at what's happening in here, and probably when I compare that frequency area to some of these guys, notice how this shape in the low mids is pretty soft in here. This is a little heavy in the 150 range, but that's just that song. But when I play some of these other ones, definitely the kick is the loudest and there's a little bit of meat going on. But when I look at my track, it's a lot heavier in here. So here's where that's going to live, by hearing it, also by seeing it. It's going to be that thickness that's most likely in that realm. Are we at final LUFS yet? Well, yeah, I'm pretty sure that question just came a little early because I talked about the fact that on my master, I use this limiter, and my LUFS monitoring or metering internally in this limiter shows it to me post output level, not with this fader adjustment. So this is showing me where I'm going to live in the outside world, and I set this to -8 because this whole concept that I talk about, the way these numbers mean something, right? So like I know that my reference tracks are level matched to -10 LUFS. I've level matched my track to -10 LUFS with -2 on my meter, on my fader. So I know that internally I'm actually needing to reach -8 so that I don't have to even look at my master to see if I'm at -10 there, because I know if I'm at -8 here and I'm taking 2 away after I'm at -8, I'm going to be -10 on my master, if that makes sense. Hopefully that makes sense. So I can actually, I don't, like I was showing you guys the workflow of looking at this meter and adjusting my limiter, but I don't actually have to because I just set this number to show me where -8 LUFS is, and then I dial in my limiter, and once it's hitting -8 LUFS, because I know I've got this -2 here, which is gonna bring it down to -10 on my master. So we are at the final LUFS that I'm gonna deliver is -8 LUFS, which is loud and competitive, but not crazy. Like, dubstep LUFS being -6 and 7 and 5 even, um, but I'm not trying to live in that type of world. Moon was asking, can you use the stock limiter for ideal results? I cannot use the stock limiter for ideal results. It won't be able to give me the type of clarity at that level. I can use it to reach a much lower level. So if I don't compensate for where I was, and so if I don't take these 2 dBs away, I can turn off this limiter and probably dial in the stock limiter to be okay, but it's still not going to be as great. It just, it's not going to compete with a, 200 and something dollar limiter that's only doing limiting versus a $700 program that has a limiter built in. But I would do, based on my settings, I would do a lot of look ahead, so it helps it work a little better. My ceiling, I kind of talked about already, right? So I want the ceiling at -1. I don't know why I can't. Yeah, I can. I'm gonna usually have it work at stereo. I'm gonna start with auto release. And so let's see what happens. If I do this. So remember, I'm trying to get -10 here. Now, I can reach that pretty good, but I'm not taking away my 2 dBs here, right? So if I wanted to compare apples to apples in terms of that limiter or this limiter to FabFilter, and I take this fader down too, because that, again, that's what allows me to get within the average loudness of my reference tracks. The reference track's frequency, I can do whatever level and level match it. It doesn't, we saw how they become useful in mixing, which is a much lower level. They're still valuable for my frequencies, but now I'm saying, well, I want to live within the average of their loudness. So the average I brought them down is 2. I bring me down 2. Now let's see how that sounds with this limiter. It's not going to sound as good. So right now I need to put about another 2 dBs of limiting on here. Starting to sound kind of too cloudy, and just sort of, let me make sure I took this EQ. No, I didn't take this EQ off, so that could be why. So let's move this back to 120. All right, so this is a pretty reputable result right now. It's not bad. Let's see, where's my output LUFS? Yeah, it's pretty close. But it still sounds more compressed than the other one. And now I'm getting closer to my, yeah, it still can't quite, yeah, it's, okay, yeah, it's there now. That's good. That's pretty solid. But if I compare it to this one, well, it's kind of glitchy and all that, but I'm even louder. But still sound cleaner with this limiter. So see how that sounds kind of more compressed, more limited, I guess? And this guy just sounds more clean and open, and it's actually a little bit louder. And so that's what I'm talking about, that I can achieve these competitive results, building in that headroom I want, really having to compress it pretty hard to reach the same LUFS so that I retain that headroom for my conversion process coming later. And I want to be competitive and sound good, but I just can't get the clarity out of it using the stock limiter. At lower levels, the stock limiter does great, but it takes a more extreme limiter to build in headroom and still reach the type of output that I'm trying to achieve. So that's why. And it says, how can we use the stock de-esser to target just certain frequencies without compressing the entire track? The stock de-esser, I'm not quite sure even how that works, but um, I yeah, that's what I was going to say. Is I would use the multiband and just dial in just
We do. It does have a de-esser though.
it has a DS preset maybe.
Oh,
Is that right? Because there's no de-esser plugin.
yeah. If you go to compressors.
Oh yeah, so it's a de-esser preset under compressors. It's a de-esser preset.
So how do you use that without compressing everything?
You can't.
Can't.
So the de-esser preset, look, this is what it's doing, right? We can translate our studies, children. We can translate our studies to what I'm looking at here. This is using a sidechain EQ that is a bandpass filter at 6K. So basically, it's just going to be the frequencies around 6K. So from probably 3K up to like 9K is all that we're going to hear if I activate this monitoring. And it's a little wider frequency than that, but ultimately it's focusing in the detection circuit listening to this 6K. But like I said, the way this compressor works is it's going to compress everything. So it's still going to be compressing everything. It would in a vocal setting using this de-esser plugin might actually work pretty well. But what I would want to do is I would want just frequency dependent compression. So I would use the multiband to do that, where I can dial in the certain frequency that I want to address. So now this is where I can say, all right, if I want to address below 8K to 3K, now my middle band is set for that, right? So I can default all of these. Default, this is my above ratio. Remember we were talking about ratio? So 1-to-1 ratio for everything above 8K means what comes in, what goes out. 1-to-1 ratio for everything below 3K is what comes in, goes out. What I can do is I can dial in some compression here, a 4-to-1 ratio, let's say, and then bring my threshold down and dial in just some mid-range compression. A lot of de-essers will work just compressing the high end. So that would be the equivalent of, say, just using this high band, where I put it at like, say, about 7K or so. I turn off, I default 1-to-1, 1-to-1. So input to output, low, input to output, mid, but my high band above 6K, I'll put a little bit of ratio on it, like about a 4 or 5-to-1, and then adjust my threshold to just compress some of those high frequencies. And remember I talked about this metering where the gold bars show you the input and the blue show you the output. So when I adjust my threshold and I see the gold bar separate away from the blue, that's how much compression I'm doing, right? There's no compression. Now we see there's some compression happening. So this line here doesn't have to get below the blue to do anything. So it's a bit confusing. We can see there's compression happening because the gold and blue are separating from one another. And as I lower it, it gets farther separated. But still, this is how I would just compress a little bit of the top end here.
Well, that sounds, I mean, you're both right. Then that de-esser is literally not even that good at all.